Before Grant Achatz became the chef most people associate with edible balloons, tabletop desserts, and one of the most famous restaurants in America, he was a kid from Michigan working at his parents' diner. Then he got fired by Charlie Trotter, he trained under TK, then helped redefine what fine dining could even be. And right in the middle of his rise, he was diagnosed with stage 4 tongue cancer and temporarily lost his sense of taste, which for a chef sounds too absurd to be real. Because unlike Thomas Keller, who built the blueprint for American fine dining, Grant Achatz took that blueprint and blew it apart. Does the legacy hold up? We chef. Most chefs obsess over precision. Grant Achatz obsesses over experience, because before Alinea, a lot of fine dining was still built around the plate. After Alinea, chefs wanted to control everything: the room, the pacing, the surprise, the memory, even how the diner emotionally moved through the meal. And whether you love that shift, or think it pushed fine dining too far into performance and spectacle, you really can't deny the influence. Because Alinea didn't just become a famous restaurant, it became one of the clearest examples of what happens when a chef stops asking, how can I make this dish better, and starts asking, how do I make this dinner unforgettable? This is the legacy of Chef Grant Achatz. Grant Achatz was born in St. Clair, Michigan in 1974, and unlike a lot of chefs who later get framed like they were destined for genius from the beginning, his story starts somewhere way less glamorous: the family diner. And honestly, this matters more than people think. Because diners teach you things that fancy kitchens just don't. They teach you speed, multitasking, repetition, how to move, how to feed people fast, how to stay organized when everything gets chaotic. And that kind of foundation sticks. When a chef never steps outside of a Michelin-star kitchen, it's kind of like a rich kid being born with a silver spoon in his mouth. They never learn how to appreciate the struggle, how to cook without every piece of equipment being brand new, or how to work with lesser cuts of meat. Because even when Achatz food got more abstract, more theatrical, and more experimental, there was still something very practical underneath it: the structure that makes a restaurant last. A lot of chefs can dream up wild ideas. Way fewer can actually build systems that make these ideas executable night after night. And from the time I spent at Alinea, I can tell you that he gets every ounce out of his team, every night, and then a little bit more. And that's part of what made Achatz dangerous later. He wasn't just imaginative, he could actually run the thing. Achatz went to culinary school at the CIA in Hyde Park, but like most serious chefs, school wasn't really what made him. School gives you vocabulary. It gets your foot in the door when a resume consisting of the family diner wouldn't get you considered. The real shaping happens once a kitchen starts humbling you. And one of the first big humblings came when he went to work for Chef Charlie Trotter in Chicago. Before Grant Achatz became Chef Grant Achatz, Charlie Trotter basically told him, "Not yet," which is a pretty insane detail in hindsight. He got fired. He didn't walk in and immediately become obvious, and honestly, that almost makes the story better. Because it kills the whole myth that the biggest chefs always arrive looking like future legends. Most of them don't. Most of them survive just long enough to become one. Then came the move that really changed everything: the French Laundry. And this is where the Keller influence enters the story in a serious way. Because if Thomas Keller built the religion of precision, Grant Achatz was absolutely a disciple of that church. And he didn't just teleport in and spend a few minutes in Yountville. Grant spent years working at the laundry, eventually becoming a sous. And during his time there, Corey Lee was the CDC, someone we will most certainly be doing a video in the future, because his legacy is just as impressive. And you can feel it, all over his later work. The control, the polish, the refusal to let details slide. The idea that even the smallest things should feel intentional. But then Achatz adds another ingredient to that foundation, because he also staged at El Bulli, which is kind of ridiculous if you think about it, because now you're combining two of the most influential restaurant philosophies on earth: Keller's discipline and Ferran Adria's endless possibility. And once those two things meet inside the same chef, you're probably not getting a normal career after that. Before Alinea, there was Trio. And Trio is where Grant Achatz's story really starts to become serious, because this is where he stops feeling like a talented young chef with good training and starts feeling like someone who might actually bend the industry. At Trio in Evanston, Achatz started getting major attention. And not just because the food was polished. A lot of chefs can do polished. What made people pay attention was that the food felt like it was trying to go somewhere else. This is where you start seeing the early DNA of what would later become Alinea. Unexpected textures, playful presentations, unusual sequencing, a little disorientation, a little mischief, and a very clear interest in making dinner feel less predictable. And the industry noticed fast. Food and Wine named him Best New Chef. James Beard named him Rising Star Chef. And once that starts happening, the chef world starts doing what it always does, whispering. Because now people are asking important questions. Okay, what happens when this guy gets his own place? That answer came in 2005 when Grant Achatz and Nick Kokonis opened Alinea in Chicago. And this is where the whole story changes. Because Alinea wasn't just another ambitious restaurant opening, it was a statement. And what made it hit so hard wasn't just that the food was technical, it's that Achatz understood something a lot of chefs still miss. People don't just remember flavor, they remember moments. And Alinea was built around moments, not just courses, moments. Plates suspended on custom hardware, aromatic pillows that release scent under hot dishes, edible centerpieces, desserts plated directly onto the table, and courses that felt revealed rather than simply served. This is not to say that Grant was the first chef in America to cook molecular gastronomy, because there were a handful that came before him. He wasn't just trying to show you what the kitchen could do, he was trying to control how the night felt. That you no longer had to go out to eat and then go see a show. Dinner could be the show. That was a much bigger ambition. And to be fair, none of that works if the food underneath is weak. That's the part that people flatten on sometimes when they talk about acts. They focus on the spectacle and forget the cooking had to actually hold up. And it did. Because under all the smoke, choreography, and invention, there was still a serious chef with serious technique. That's why Alinea didn't feel like a gimmick. It felt authored. And this is really where Grant Achatz separates himself from a lot of other famous chefs. Because he wasn't just trying to make the best version of a dish, he was trying to redesign the language of dining itself. That's a different kind of ambition. Most chefs want every detail to be perfect. Achatz wanted every detail to be alive. And that meant pulling from way more than just cuisine. Design, architecture, aroma, temperature, narrative, psychology, timing, movement. He made chefs think beyond the plate. And whether you personally love Alinea's style or think some of it can feel a little too performative, the influence is undeniable. Because after Act's experience became part of the assignment. And once that happens, the whole industry shifts. Now chefs aren't just asking, what am I serving? They're asking, what is the guest going to feel? That's a huge change. And a lot of that traces back here. And then, right when Alinea is becoming one of the most important restaurants in America, the story takes a turn that honestly feels almost too cruel to be real. In 2007, Grant Achatz was diagnosed with stage 4 tongue cancer, which for anyone is terrifying. But for a chef, it's almost absurdly specific, because this wasn't just a health crisis. It was a threat to the exact tool his entire life had been built around. And the really brutal part is that some of the doctors recommended removing most of his tongue, which would have almost certainly ended the career of him as he knew it.
Biopsy, I was just like shocked. It turns out it was cancer. The doctor's telling me, Mr. Achatz, I have bad news. Cancer is very advanced, stage 4. And he looked me dead in the eyes and says, if we don't remove your tongue, you're gonna die in about 6 months.
Instead, Achatz pursued an aggressive treatment path, chemotherapy, radiation, a gamble. And during treatment, he lost his sense of taste almost entirely. Just think about that for a second, how insane it is. One of the most important chefs in America, running one of the most ambitious restaurants in America, while literally unable to taste. That alone would be enough to define most careers, but somehow he came through it. He was declared cancer-free in 2008, and over time, his sense of taste started returning. And whether you think that part of his story gets mythologized too heavily or not, it still matters. Because after that, Achatz stopped feeling like just a brilliant chef and started feeling almost impossible to stop. And that changes how people see you. It changes how your work is read. It changes how your legacy is built. Grant didn't just become the chef behind one legendary restaurant. He became part of building one of the more influential restaurant groups in the modern era. And after Alinea, then came Next, then the Avery, then the Office, and later Royster. And what's interesting is that unlike a lot of chef empires that just feel like watered-down brand extensions, these actually felt like different creative lanes. Next might honestly be one of the smartest restaurant concepts of the last 20 years. because instead of locking itself into one permanent identity, Next built entirely new concepts: menus, service pieces, ambiance, uniforms, service style, everything. One menu was Paris in 1906, then Thailand, childhood nostalgia, vegan fine dining, and Sicily, just to name a few. It turned reinvention into the business model. The Avery, which took the same Alinea mindset and applied it to cocktails. Not just drinks, but presentation, design, temperature, aroma, sequence, the whole thing. The Office stripped things down in a different direction and made it feel more intimate, more exclusive, and more controlled. At Royster, Grant showed that even when things got more casual, the obsession with experience and detail was still there. This is where Grant's emphasis on performance and spectacle comes full circle. Because through Alinea Group, especially with Next, dinner stopped functioning like a normal reservation and started functioning like a ticketed event, prepaid, time-specific, controlled, closer to buying a seat at a performance than just booking a reservation somewhere. And while Nick Kokonis was really the business brain behind this system, it only worked because Grant had helped build the kind of restaurant where diners were willing to approach such a radical model. And that's a huge part of Grant's legacy too. Not that he just helped change food and what it looked like, but that he helped change what a restaurant was. And like any chef who becomes this influential, Ac's career also comes with criticism. Some of it is philosophical, that Alinea helped push fine dining further into spectacle, performance, luxury, and exclusivity. That dinner started becoming less about being fed and more about being orchestrated. Some people love that. Some people absolutely don't. And honestly, both reactions make sense. Because once restaurants become this conceptual, you're no longer just being judged on whether the food is good. Now you're being judged on whether the whole idea still feels worth it. And that's a much harder standard to keep satisfying forever. But honestly, that tension is part of why Acts still matters. Because people only argue this much about restaurants that actually change something. Nobody debates the safe ones this hard. But like every restaurant empire, cracks started showing. Because no chef gets to become this influential without eventually running into the limits of scale, expectation, and cultural change. Some concepts didn't hold forever. The New York versions of the Avery and the Office eventually closed. Royster is out, making room for new direction. And Alinea itself has changed, as the restaurant has gone through reinventions, renovations, and more recent questions that eventually come for every famous restaurant. Is it still the center of where fine dining is headed? With the answer likely being no. With Alinea losing its third star in 2025 and last appearing on the 50 best list in 2019. And that's not an insult, that's just business. Because molecular gastronomy is expensive. When most chefs' biggest equipment expenses are ranges, combi ovens, and a Vitaprep, Grant was spending on centrifuges, roto-evaporators, and anti-griddles. And when the expectation is to use the highest quality ingredients, Grant also needs to spend on sodium alginate and kappa-carrageenan. In an industry with historically low margins, most simply couldn't justify the expense. And eventually, what once felt radical stopped feeling feasible. Fine dining borrowed what it could rationalize: the cryovac machines, liquid nitrogen, and xanthan gum. But the rest stayed at Alinea. And that's what makes the story more interesting. It didn't follow the life cycle of innovation, adaptation, oversaturation, and irrelevance. It just couldn't be replicated by the masses. And at a time when we're nearing the oversaturation phase of new Nordic cuisine, Alinea remains just as innovative, just as special, and even more unique. And then there's the broader influence. First, let's get to Ac's chef tree, which is pretty impressive. He trained 2 chefs that would go on to earn 3 Michelin stars, Curtis Duffy and John Shields. Those are the heavy hitters. Duffy earned 3 stars at Grace before it closed, and now currently holds 2 at Ever. Shields received 3 stars at Smith, the only 3-star currently in Chicago. Then there's Dave Brand and Jenner Tomaska, who both run Michelin-starred kitchens. And don't forget about Alex Stupak, who went from molecular pastry chef to running one of the most impactful Mexican restaurant empires in New York. Then there's everything else, because Ac's influence led him to eventually stop being measured only by what he cooked and starts being measured by what he changed. And Alinea's impact is everywhere, not just in chefs who literally worked for him, but in the entire generation of restaurants that started treating dinner like a fully authored experience instead of just a sequence of courses. You can feel that influence in tasting menus, in cocktail bars, in service design, in menu architecture, in restaurants that now think about pacing, reveal, tension, surprise, and emotional shape, almost like filmmakers. That's a huge legacy, Because dishes disappear, techniques go out of style, and restaurants close. But once you permanently change how chefs think, that part sticks. And Axe absolutely did that. So what is Grant Achatz' actual legacy? It's not just that he opened Alinea. It's not just that he beat cancer. It's not just that he made some of the most iconic modern dishes of his era. It's that he helped prove fine dining didn't only have to be about refinement. It could be strange, emotional, playful, disorienting, theatrical, and even a little absurd. And whether you think that made restaurants more exciting or just more self-conscious, it absolutely changed the game. Grant Achatz showed chefs they were allowed to completely mess with the establishment. And once that happened, there was no going back. But if Grant changed the way chefs thought about experience, the next chef changed the way they thought about ingredients. Because next up, on episode 5 of Chef Legacies, Alice Waters. This is Chef's Legacies. If you enjoyed this video or any of our other videos, please give us a follow and subscribe for more stories behind the world's most influential chefs.